we talked briefly about the lockdowns, and I think you're right. There was sort of a mania, and everyone, it was like a giant game of Simon Says. Everyone would do what the other jurisdiction did, because I guess if everyone was doing it, you couldn't get in trouble for doing it. And I think there was a madness that took over. But we're almost 3 years to the anniversary of, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve and the beginning of the lockdown. So I really think Alberta has moved on completely. You don't even see NDPers wearing masks anymore.
Well, you do in the legislature.
Oh, that's right. What am I saying? For theatrical purposes, I guess. But I think that a lot of people have moved on in Canada and around the world. But I feel like some parts of this government have not. Just last Friday, a pastor from Calgary, Arthur Pavlovsky, was in court being prosecuted for a potential $100,000 fine for a public health order that's a couple years old now. Now, it was stayed, and there was no conviction, and he's won a few of his other cases. But there's another pastor, Church in the Vine, $80,000 fine. They're still battling in court. There's a restaurateur named Chris Scott. So there's all these pastors and small businessmen, none of them violent. And the world has moved on, but Alberta Health and Alberta Justice are still prosecuting. And they haven't had a lot of wins, but they've had a few. And it just feels like a hangover from a bygone era. It doesn't feel like it's in sync with the times. Is there a way to move on? It feels like a vendetta from some prosecutors that really want to punish these guys. That's how, now I'm coming from a very strong point of view. I support these guys. And I know you've got to be, you can't meddle in a judicial process, but boy, it doesn't feel like it's in the public interest.
I think we learned a lot about how our justice system works in watching things at the federal level and how the Attorney General and the Crown have an independence from the Premier's office. The questions that I can ask and have asked and continue to ask is it in the public interest? And is there a reasonable likelihood of conviction? And I think the longer that we go on seeing that prosecutions are not being successful, it makes a stronger case on both of those fronts. That if the conviction isn't likely, we know that we have a lot of pressure on our courts. And if the public has now come to terms with wanting a different approach, is it in the public interest? It's becoming increasingly hard to answer those two questions. Now, I put it to the prosecutors, and I've asked them to do a review of the cases with those two things in mind. And I'm hopeful that we'll see a true turning of the page, because I think you're very right that something changed in February when the Freedom Convoy took place. That I think people realize that now we know more about this virus. We have more effective means to be able to address it. That some of the extreme measures that may have had a lot of widespread support early on, they just don't have the same widespread support today. And so, do you continue on in prosecuting when the public has moved on? That's the big question that the Crown has got to come to terms with. That's
really how marijuana decriminalization happened. It did happen legislatively, but for years, prosecutors just did not prosecute small possession of marijuana, even though it was against the law. There are 3 truckers from Lethbridge, not violent, no firearms. One of them was a town councillor in Fort Macleod. They're being prosecuted. The prosecutor wants 10 years in prison. This is at the Coots blockade. And I'm glad you're looking into that.
Well, and you can see as well, we do have some latitude to decide how we're going to prioritize our policing resources. We've seen our justice minister, for instance, say that he does not think that the federal gun confiscation scheme is in line with what our policing priorities are. Our policing priorities are going after hardened criminals, people who are smuggling guns across the border. And so I think that we're in the process of trying to sort through some of that. Remember, I've only been in office now for like 11 weeks. I just finally became an MLA on November 29th. So I'm asking the questions, and I'm doing it in a way that I think is consistent with how our system works. That in the end, if there is no reasonable likelihood or conviction and it's not in the public interest, the Crown's going to have to be mindful of that.
That's an excerpt from my show every night. It's called The Ezra Levant Show. That's me, Ezra Levant. You can see the whole thing behind our paywall. Well, there's a lot of goodies behind there. I do a show every weeknight. My friends Sheila Gunn Reid and David Menzies and Nat and Kat have their shows too. You get a ton of content for just $8 a month. There's so much in there you won't find anywhere else. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.